Good evening, everyone. Greetings from St. Francis Retreat Center here at Mepkin Abbey, and we're so happy to be hosting this episode of Contemplative Ecology. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sam and let him welcome you and introduce our speaker tonight.
Thanks so much, Father Garrick, and welcome everybody to almost the 1 year threshold, which we are approaching, of the formation of this Mepkin Abbey Forum for Contemplative Ecology, which we formed in honor of the memory of Brother Kyle Berceau and his vision for this forum and gathering to nourish our ecological spirituality continues to be the guiding light that orients our monthly gatherings here. And I'm very pleased to share that an article was just written by Notre Dame Magazine about the life and incredible spirituality of Brother Kyle. And so we're going to put that in the chat and encourage everybody to really sit with this article, which I had the chance to read earlier today, and really brought me back to this beautiful walk that Brother Kyle and I shared a few years ago through the beautiful oak-draped land of Mepkin Abbey before he passed on. So we're going to put that article in the chat and remember his abiding spirit with us this evening. So this evening, we are very fortunate to be joined by a friend and collaborator, Jason Brown. And Jason and I have intersecting journeys in many ways. Jason Brown was born and raised in Southern California and studied anthropology and international development as an undergraduate at Brigham Young University. He has lived in Vancouver, BC since 2013 and became a Canadian citizen in 2024, recently. He earned joint master's degrees in forestry and theology from Yale, also studying with Professors Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm. So we share similar mentors in our vocational journey. Jason completed his PhD in 2017 from the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia, where his dissertation explored the sense of place of contemporary Catholic monks in the American West. As a lecturer at Simon Fraser University, Jason teaches courses in comparative religion and ecological humanities for the Department of Global Humanities. And in 2023, he started an ecological chaplaincy program at Simon Fraser University, which seeks to bring contemplative practice to climate anxiety and grief. The program is one of only a few such initiatives in North America. And Jason is also an avid writer at holyscapes.org. And we very much encourage you to check out his blog when you get the chance. On a personal note, Jason and I had a very synchronistic encounter in the sacred land of Assisi a few years ago. After only connecting virtually a few times, we happened to run into each other in the birthplace of St. Francis and St. Clare, which felt like a very opportune way to meet Jason. So with that, I want to welcome Jason to this growing community.
Great, thanks, Sam. Good to see you, if only virtually.
Good to see you too, Jason.
Yeah.
And I want to invite you, if you are compelled, to offer a poem or a contemplative practice to help ground us in this space this evening.
Yeah. When you asked me to lead us in a spiritual practice, I was wondering what on earth could I do on Zoom, because I mean, I can just see us, I can see the Zoom energy. People are multitasking, and like there's just, the Zoom world is such a strange, almost anti-spiritual place. And yet, right, we're all drawn together to feed each other and nourish each other spiritually. And so, I don't know, last year, the year before, in the midst of, trying to do work like this together online, I wrote a poem called A Prayer at the Beginning of a Zoom Meeting. So I'll read that. And I'll just invite folks to let this prayer ground you a bit. And, both in your body and in this incomprehensible digital space. Here it goes. Prayer at the beginning of a Zoom meeting. As our eyes take in this fidgeting grid, may we attune ourselves to the immensity of what is here now. A sacrament of global community. We are not an illusion, even in this improvised church where we cannot sit in a circle. May we encircle this place with our presence and pray for each other as we move through time in many different spaces. As my voice flows through the unseen neurons of the noosphere, may we attune to the feelings that these words evoke. The sounds we make are the same sounds. The silence between our words is the same silence. And it connects us to the deep well of silence that is the habitat of God. Even as we sit in our beloved and strange material habitats, and as our faces ripple through the electric plasma, may we stay close to our bodies, from fingers to toes. The light that illuminates our faces is the same light. And though we cannot shake each other's hands, we cannot embrace. May we touch each other's hearts from across this proximate distance.
Amen.
Amen. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
And yeah, I guess I'd love to hear where people are from in the chat. If people could let us all know where you're from. I'm tuning in from Vancouver in British Columbia. And I know, Sam, are you still in Connecticut?
I
Yeah.
am New Haven, Connecticut.
All right. Where are folks coming to us from?
I am from the eastern townships of Quebec.
All right. We got Quebec. We've got California, East Coast, West Coast, Portland.
Florida.
We've got another British Columbian, Nova Scotia, Louisville. Oh, it's Paul Pearson from the Minton Society. Woo. Very cool. Well,
I am
nice
from
to see everyone.
South Carolina. I'm actually at Mepkin tonight.
Oh, lovely. Lovely. Great. Yeah, we've got lots in the chat and love to hear your voices as well.
From Chicago.
Chicago.
Bat Cave, Western North Carolina. Great to see you tonight.
Great.
Wonderful. Great to have all of these places represented in our collective community this evening. And thank you, Jason, for grounding us in place and in this interconnectedness that brings us all together this evening from distant lands. So I thought we would start by just hearing a little bit more about your journey, Jason, because you've had a very unique journey that has taken you across this continent, one that has taken you into the realm of professional forestry and also into the spiritual elements of forestry work and conservation work. And naturally, in this community exploring contemplative ecology, we'd love to hear a little bit more about your story and how did you become so drawn to this confluence of religion and ecology?
Mhm. Oof. Yeah, great. It's a great question, a big open biographical question. So I was born in Southern California and mostly raised in Yorba Linda, which is the hometown of Richard Nixon, if people aren't familiar. And Yorba Linda, and right as I was coming into consciousness, had been a very sleepy backwater rural place where they grew avocados and oranges. And before that, it was part of the Tongva and the other indigenous territories of Southern California before they were missionized. Um, but as I came into consciousness, the world was turning Orange County into a strip mall, basically. So it went from, you know, thousands of acres of orchards into thousands of acres of housing and mostly consumer centers, including, my house was included in that in the 1970s. And my house was basically on right next door to the historic farmhouse of that block, right? It was a sun-kissed orchard. And then in the 70s, they built houses for families, accommodating families in the growth of Southern California. And so I was right on the cusp of that, right? And so I grew up watching these chunks of orchard turn into housing. And then that kind of followed me everywhere I went. When I went to Utah, they were doing that. My parents retired to Arizona and they're doing that now outside of Phoenix. And so that's been kind of a thread, right? That land and life is in some ways under siege. But I was raised in a Mormon family. My parents more or less reverted or converted to Mormonism when I was young, and so that was the religious vocabulary of my upbringing. And we spent a lot of time outdoors, doing camping trips. But a lot of if someone were to ask me what are the most significant trees of my upbringing, it would be, international trees like orange trees and eucalyptus trees and the pepper tree, which is from South America. And my neighborhood basically, even though, it replaced a scrub ecology and then it replaced a orchard ecology, it was an international arboretum of trees. Like there were just trees from all over the world. So that was a pretty significant thing. In my early 20s, I was a Mormon missionary for the Mormon Church, and I went to the Dominican Republic. And I would say that a lot of my sensibility toward ecology, botany, and social justice came from that experience. So 2 years in the Dominican Republic, uh, you know, getting to know people there and trying to understand, the way that people lived, in a way that was very different from the very sleepy and geometric kind of architecture of Orange County. I had a person from the Dominican Republic go to my hometown while I was in the DR, and she said, walking around your neighborhood feels like I'm in a cemetery, right? She said it felt so quiet and like kind of devoid of human interaction. So there was just this big contrast between growing up in Orange County and then going to the Dominican Republic. But then I came back from the Dominican Republic and I saw the place in a totally different light. I was kind of plant blind before I left, and when I got back from the Dominican Republic, I was noticing how much tropical and subtropical, plants and trees there were in my own neighborhood. And there was just this real turn towards the ecological after the Dominican Republic. So I studied anthropology, And while I was studying at the Mormon University in Utah, um, began a kind of a long and drawn out crisis of faith that stayed with me through my time at Yale in forestry school. But while I was wandering the library stacks one evening in at Brigham Young, I came across Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm's books on religion and ecology, the series Religion and Ecology, which is, like 10 volumes from their conferences from the 90s. And something definitely clicked in me because before that I was interested in anthropology and maybe ecological anthropology. But then I realized that you could, bring these two domains of my life together that were in some ways wrestling for my attention. And religion and ecology became kind of in the back of my mind, something to do. But even then, I didn't realize that when I got to Yale to do forestry, I didn't know until I got there that Mary Evelyn and John Grimm were at Yale doing the program in religion and ecology, so there was this really cool serendipity that I was like, okay, I want to do like social ecology of forests and forestry. I'm going to go try this program. And then I realized that the religion and ecology was there, and all that came rushing back. And so I started thinking about the intersection of religion and forests. I went to the Mormon Sacred Grove in Palmyra, New York, which is a 100-acre or so forest that the Mormon Church has preserved as the traditional site of Joseph Smith's, professed revelatory experiences. And the guy who manages the forest isn't a Mormon, but he really loves the forest, and he just wants to care for it. And so that really kind of got me thinking. And then when I was on the forest field trip for the Yale School of Forestry, we went to a Carthusian monastery, and that like kind of clicked for me. I was like, okay, I'm kind of moving away from Mormonism. I'm kind of open to this broader Catholic notion of God and spirituality, sacramental spirituality. And so I started looking into how, whether North American monasteries actually have some kind of ecological framing. It seemed like they were very land rich in Europe, but I didn't know if that was true in North America. And so I started finding, monastery after monastery with these beautiful properties in California and Oregon and Washington, and so I started visiting and emailing and talking to the monks, and I did some retreats with them to get to know them, and they allowed me to come back as a researcher, and that's what I ended up doing for my PhD at UBC here in British Columbia, which is why I moved to Canada. And so all along, right, that contemplative and that ecological are kind of being woven together in different ways. But definitely it was, ecology and then forestry and then monasticism as a institutional expression of that. And now I would say since I've, written the dissertation and wrote the book about sense of place and monks, I'm trying to expand and broaden that, what contemplative ecology looks like. And I guess we'll circle back to this, but especially as it relates to my students and their, anxiety around climate change. So that's more or less the trajectory: anthropology, forestry, and then theology, and then my PhD, both professional and personal interests kind of intersecting all along the way.
Such a wonderful forest eye view of your journey, Jason. Thank you for taking us through these really formative and rich experiences that have shaped you. Ones that perhaps you could never have anticipated until you lived the questions, right? And had such rich experiences.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's a motto for me, that Rilke, living the questions. I was so relieved when I heard that you could do that. Because I came from a tradition that was so invested in the answers, So the spirituality of darkness, the dark night of the soul, living into the questions, those have all accompanied my contemplative journey for sure. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that.
Hmm. Most definitely. And, because we are connected to this incredible monastery and 3,000-acre parcel of land along the Cooper River, which is the site of Mebken Abbey, Jason, I think many of us are interested in monasticism as a practice and monasticism in this time of ecological crisis and this, the tremendous changes that are afoot in our world, right? And thinking about the enduring importance of monasticism. And so I just love to hear a little bit more from you about what did your studies and research illumine to you about the importance of monastic spirituality and in connection to ecology, especially from your many visits to these different monasteries?
Yeah, so yeah, I spent 20 basically from 2015 until 2024 thinking about that question. Because I wrote the dissertation on monasticism and sense of place and a little bit on ecological kind of theology and management of monasteries. But then the book was much thinner, much more concise, and that was more about my experience at these monasteries that I visited, and as you say, kind of what I learned, right? So when I give talks about the book, I don't say, that this is what monasticism, you know, writ large says about land management. I try not to speak for the monks, but I try to speak about what I learned in my visits, as you say, as you frame the question. And so I spent the most time that I've spent at a monastery is one called Our Lady of Guadalupe Abbey. It's a Trappist abbey in Carlton, Oregon. It's one of the first places I did extensive retreats, though. I guess the first retreat I ever did at a monastery was Our Lady of the Holy Trinity in Huntsville, Utah, when I was teaching religion in Salt Lake before I moved to BC. And that monastery has since closed down. But you can find in a couple of Google searches, the monastery took very special care to make sure their property was put into a conservation easement. So the legacy of the monks at Our Lady of the Holy Trinity is still intact in some ways. At least the land or the property is still contiguous. And so I also spent time at New Camaldoli, which is Camaldoli's order in Central California, and New Clairvaux, which is another Trappist abbey in Vina, California, and Christ in the Desert, which is in New Mexico. And it's a bit of a hobby of mine to visit monasteries. So I've been to many other monasteries, though I've never been to Mebken, which I would love to do. Yeah, I definitely need to get out that way. And so as I was, the method that I used to study this question, right, relationship between monasticism and the land and sense of place, was mostly a walking interview. Some of the monks are maybe a little too old to go for walks in some of these places, so we would just sit down and chat. But most of the monks, I would clip a microphone to my shoulder and we'd walk together on the land and just talk about the different places that resonated with them. And I kind of expected them to, have almost like a shrine, like this is this place that is sacred to me. And it's sacred because of this, and this. But what I often found was that monks would take me to a very nondescript place on a trail or even on a pathway between, the refectory and the chapel. And they would say, in very holy and reverent tones, they would say, right here is where it happened, and this is where I had a kind of epiphany that kept me in my vocation in the monastery. So there was this sort of it wasn't chosen, as Belden Lane talks about. Sacred place is not always chosen, it chooses. So it breaks through. And that was very common in the land, in monastic landscapes, that monks would take me to places that were invisible to me, right? They seemed lovely, but they had a story attached to them. And so in some of the ways that we talk about the beauty of indigenous traditions who have these rich and storied landscapes that have developed over millennia, what we see with the men that I interviewed who've been living in places for 30, 40, sometimes 50 years, we start to see the germination of those seeds of place, of rootedness in place, where these monks were starting to develop a real attachment, connection to the place. And it wasn't just that they were Catholics projecting Catholic ideas onto a landscape, right? That was like otherwise meaningless. The landscape itself was participating in the dialogue, right? So they would definitely have psalms, that they chanted every day, but the landscape populated those psalms in some ways. So, for example, at New Camaldoli, there's a passage in the Psalms that say the mountains will melt like wax, and the monk said, well, sometimes we get such heavy rains that this really clay soil looks like it's melting like wax, and so there's this way in which the land, right, populates the language and the imagery of the Psalms, right? It doesn't just go from the religious imagination out into the land. The land is actually, putting its tendrils into the imagery of the Psalms in a lot of ways. And so that's one of the big kind of theoretical pieces or claims of the book, that sense of place is a dialogue, right? It's not just a cultural construction or a symbolic projection. It's a conversation. So the land populates our ideas about the land in lots of ways. You could talk about that as a kind of phenomenological approach, but yeah, we don't have to go down that philosophical pathway. And so I learned, just how important it is to pay attention to the land, right? To listen to what the land is saying and speaking, and to get to know the land better. So there's I mean, as much as these monks love their land, they still spend a lot of time in church. And so, there's a liturgy of the church, but there's also a liturgy of the land. And that's very apparent at Our Lady of Guadalupe, because the chapel is essentially transparent to the sky, to the world. You can see all around. And so the weather and the season are very much participants in the liturgy of the hours and the liturgical cycles and seasons. And so the liturgy of place is something that I've been trying to tune myself into. I actually realized I'm really not very good at the liturgy of hours. There's just so much words, and I get so distracted by the words. I really want to just be outside and go and spend time with the liturgy of the land. And so I coined a term that I use to guide my contemplative ecology practice, which is placefulness. So instead of mindfulness, where I'm trying to cultivate a sense of place through placefulness. And placefulness, it's on the one hand, there's a bit of grief in my placefulness because I'll never have the kind of attachment to this place that the Musqueam and the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples of British Columbia have. They have thousands of years. The bones of their ancestors are in this place. I'll never have that kind of connection, that rich of a storytelling, or that deep of a cultural wound from colonization. And I won't even necessarily have the same kind of attachment that, Brother Garrick has to Mepkin for however long he's lived at Mepkin, or the monks in Guadalupe that have been there since they founded it. And, this where people have lived in one place. I've moved around quite a bit. And so placefulness is not just a sort of romance of place. It's a posture of openness to what is unfolding before our eyes on the land in the place. And so, you can imagine how lovely that is in a place where you've been for many years, but also it's important as a posture of activism in a time when climate change is going to impact places very differently. So placefulness is not just about, the warm and fuzzy feelings we get for the places, but it's also the discomfort and the anxiety as we watch our places change before our eyes, or species that we love go extinct, or the birds that we expect to come back don't return. And so placefulness has to be both a spiritual practice and a kind of strategy to responding to the times that we're living in. And yeah, I'll let you jump in here and see if you want to guide me back to the question. But those are some of the things that I brought out of my experience with the 4 monasteries that I wrote about in the dissertation and the book.
Thanks, Jason. And I'm very struck by this idea of placefulness. And I'm grateful to you for introducing us to that term. And it really brings me back to Thomas Berry's essay, The Spirituality of the Earth, in which we're brought into the sensibility that we are participating somehow in the spirituality inherent to the land and to the earth. And we're not necessarily projecting a spirituality from the human onto the earth or the land. And I find that to be a very profound distinction you've brought us toward. I'd love to hear you reflect more, Jason, on your particular connection with trees, which you mentioned in your introductory remarks. And I know you've taught on some of the mythological importance of trees and the even the cosmic importance of trees. I know we've had conversations about the importance of the cosmic tree in even the Christmas experience. And so I wanted to draw you out a little bit more to think about both your personal relationship with trees and then also how you experience trees as a gateway into sacred presence.
Gateway. All right. Trees. Okay. Well, like I say, the trees that I met first were eucalyptus and orange trees that were, most closely at hand. Though I guess, I do remember the live oaks too, in the marginal lands, the lands that hadn't quite been, turned under by the pavement. They still have, right, these beautiful live oak, several, I don't know how many species, but at least 2 different live oak species in Southern California. But when I was in Guatemala for the anthropology undergraduate field study that I was doing, I was studying the relationship between kind of smallholder cultivators and foresters with the Guatemalan state forestry enterprise. So there was this, sort of like state peasant dynamic between how forests were imagined and thought about. And so anthropology was teaching me this cultural literacy of the landscape, but I didn't really have a good sense of what the ecological landscape was doing. And I knew that it had been significantly impacted by people, but I didn't really understand. And there was in some ways kind of an epiphany moment when I was like, oh, I should study forestry. So I mean, that might be the most significant turn towards trees in my professional career. And so I ended up at Yale School of Forestry, but then I felt kind of out of place at Yale School of Forestry because it was a lot of like environmental science and resource managers. And I was like, well, I'm kind of more of an anthropologist. But then, I realized that I was actually more of a theologian of forests and trees and forests. And so that that realization kind of developed gradually. And so just realizing through the Mormon experience of their sacred grove in Palmyra, realizing just how pervasive trees and forests are in the history of religion and spirituality, right? And all the way through the wilderness movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, right? Where trees and forests were brought into this kind of holistic view of forests that was framed as a kind of sacred space, even if it wasn't, in direct reference to God. And so that really developed. And after I graduated from Yale, my dream course was to teach a course on trees and forests in the human imagination, the sort of the long history of our entanglement with trees. And there's been a real renaissance of like what you could call like forest studies, the new forestry, you might call it. Suzanne Simard is a great icon of this movement, right? Like now, so the 20th century was marked by an agricultural view of trees. And now we're trying to understand the forest as an emergent property of many different organisms and species, working together. But what's interesting about the Western imagination is that we're really bad at complexity and nuance. And so in our policy, we're either thinking about the forest as like, a sacred space that should exclude people, or it's a multi-use zone where we're prioritizing resources for human flourishing, right? And so it's either an agricultural model or it's a kind of intact ecological kind of quasi-sacred model. And that's just not, that's not a very common, historically speaking, that's not a very common orientation towards the forest, because most indigenous peoples today both revere the forest as sacred and even personify trees as ancestors or persons in the cultural sense, but are also quite interested in interacting with and managing and using the gifts of the forest, as Robin Wall Kimmerer would say, right? Robin Wall Kimmerer says we should change all of our resource management departments to, the Department of Earthly Gifts. And that's the understanding that I think many rural and indigenous peoples have, is that there's a much more of a symbiosis, like as Thomas Berry would say, right? Mutually beneficial relationship, symbiotic relationship between people and place and earth. And so that has been kind of at the heart of my interest, is tracking these cultural movements, right? So the development of the categories of what kinds of sacred trees, how do trees show up? Are they, cosmic trees? Are they symbolic trees? To what extent do trees have a kind of personhood? And how do they show up in rituals? How do they show up as actual characters, right? So a lot of the Western literature, trees develop as either material resources or symbolic resources. But in a lot of our myths and stories that are on the cusp of the agricultural kind of framing, trees actually speak, right? Even, and we don't have to go that far into the Western imagination to find speaking trees. The Dream of the Rood is a poem, an Anglo-Saxon poem where the cross is actually personified and speaks of being cut down. Or in the Finnish national myth, which was only compiled and written in the 19th century, the trees speak, right? They help Vainamoinen decide which tree is the best tree to use to build a boat, right? So there's both an animancy and an agency and a use value in those trees. So anyways, those are some of the questions that I'm interested in when it comes to trees and forests. And I do a class at SFU called Trees, Forests, and the Human Imagination. And I have an adapted contemplative ecology retreat or workshop that I do as well. And there's actually one coming up with the Forest Stewards Guild. It's an American organization, but we're doing a webinar in a couple of weeks actually that'll be 3 weeks in a row on trees and forests and the human imagination. So if anyone's interested in that, we'll be going into some detail about some of these stories and characters of tree people, you could say.
Thank you for bringing us into that enlarged context for how we relate to trees, how the human family has related to trees and forests in many different ways throughout the millennia, Jason. So much more we could explore in that terrain. And I appreciate you bringing us into this symbiotic experience with trees, right? A kind of perhaps middle space between revering the trees as set apart and you know, entities that we can never touch or harvest, or reverentially bring into human uses, and balancing that with the clear cutting model of seeing a forest as a collection of objects for timber harvesting, right? How do we enter into a reverential and reciprocal relationship with trees? And thank you for bringing Suzanne Simard into this conversation. Art, thank you for the Peter Levin book that you just put in the chat, which is also wonderful.
There's just so many cool books out there right now, right? Like the one that I just read is called the Island of Missing Trees, right? Which is has a talking fig tree at the heart of the novel, and it's actually kind of a romantic story too. It's like a Greek and a Turk fall in love in early mid 20th century Cyprus, when there was all this tension between Greeks and Turks in Cyprus, and there's this fig tree at the center of the story. So yeah, there's just so, and that's a novel actually, but yeah, lots of philosophy and resource management and ecology coming out related to trees and the complexity of communication.
Absolutely. I confess that book was gifted to me, but I have yet to read it. So this is a helpful reminder, Jason, to journey.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, it's not a perfect novel, but it's a really fun novel. I might actually use it in my class.
Amazing. Well, Jason, I wanted to also segue to talk a little bit more about your work with young people, and especially in your work most recently as an ecological chaplain, because I think that's something a lot of us are thinking about, is how do we offer pastoral care at a time of climate crisis, right? So many of the young people I work with, right, are experiencing angst around the state of forests, land, water, climate. I think, the Lancet organization has done surveys documenting the rates of climate anxiety among young people, and it's so rampant. And I would be curious to hear from you about what is this kind of emerging role as an ecological chaplain, and how do some of these immersive experiences that you're facilitating perhaps help to provide a sense of solace and connectedness that can perhaps help us weather these very challenging times?
Yeah, there's some great words in there. I love that word solace, right? So the philosopher Glenn Albrecht coined a new word, solastalgia. You've probably all heard that word, riffing on nostalgia, right? Which is nostalgia is the longing for the places we call home that we've been disconnected from, right? Even in the 19th century, Swiss mercenaries died of nostalgia, right? Like it was a medical condition that people were diagnosed with. So Glenn Albrecht says solastalgia is this condition of watching the places we're in change before our eyes, right? So solastalgia now has solace, the word you use, Sam, is solace. So it now has that, it has that connotation in this human era, right? That solace is also, it's bittersweet because yes, our places might be protected. We might live in the middle of a giant park with, or like our region might be committed to green space and, but climate change is going to impact these places very differently. And so the chaplaincy program came out of my experience teaching an environmental ethics class where my students were quite kind of pessimistic and a bit sardonic about the future, right? Like, I mean, I'm not going to have kids, or, oh, I probably won't find a job, or, well, basically the world is ending, so what does it matter? Like lots of that kind of like joking. There's some dark humor coming out of those conversations around ecology. And, students saying, for as long as I can remember, right, there's been something wrong with the world. And so the students are growing up in this era of crisis. And in some ways, they've just completely compartmentalized and spend all their time on TikTok. But for those of them who are paying attention, right, it's manifesting in acute mental health issues, right? And so what the climate chaplaincy or the ecological chaplaincy program does is try to situate itself between the activist student clubs and the career office, which are like, okay, here are the things you can do. There's so many things you can do when we're in a poly crisis, right? I mean, there's almost everything we do matters in a poly crisis. So get to work. There's lots to do. So we're in between, right? That like activist orientation. And then on the other end is the sort of, acute mental health crises. So the counseling office. So the chaplaincy approach is one that takes a vocational approach. We want to invite students into a conversation about what they're called, what the world is calling them to do in these times, right? To investigate their interests, their talents, the things that give them joy, and to get to connect with those things. So there's a vocational dimension that we don't really talk about in career services or therapy. And then we try to get people to get comfortable with discomfort. So we invite people to cultivate curiosity about the complicated feelings about climate change, right? What would it look like if we just sat with the fact that we're not going to reach the 1.5 degree targets or even the 2 degree Celsius warming targets, right? We need to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. And so we do that in a kind of a talking circle model or the climate cafe model, where students can come in and just, say how they feel with other students without us trying to fix them or fix the world. And then hopefully, out of those climate cafe circles, those talking circles, some ideas might bubble up, but that's not where we start, right? We don't start with, okay, well, your lifestyle's all wrong, so you need to fix that. And you better find something to do that's meaningful. And also, quick, write a sign for this protest we're going to that's not going to do anything. We're trying to invite people into a space of safety and curiosity about how strange and difficult the times are, first of all. And then, that hopefully that will build a network of people interested in working together, collaborating. But that has to be an emergent property of the the connecting with our feelings, right? So Joanna Macy's model of honoring our pain for the world is just one of the steps in the work that reconnects. And then we are experimenting with contemplative ecology practices that will build resilience for the students in their daily lives. And in my classes, in my upper division classes, I always assign a field journal. So every week they have to go out into the world. In the forest class, they have to find a sit spot and go there for an hour every week. And so that's one of the things that I encourage people to do in my class. Well, I make them do it. And then I've had emails where they're like, I still go to my sit spot. I love that place. And then with the chaplaincy program, every other week or so, we'll invite people into what I call a contemplative forest walk. And the contemplative forest walk is not quite forest bathing, and it's not quite hiking, right? It's somewhere in the middle. So the contemplative forest walk is, I give them 3 prompts, right? One, if you're new to this, just walk and pay attention to your breath as you're walking, right? So it's like a bit of a walking meditation. 2, pay attention to your non-visual senses. What are you hearing, right? What are you smelling? And if it's spring, early summer, maybe what are you tasting? Because we got salmon berries, for example. And then the 3rd prompt is to zoom in and zoom out, right? Spend some time with the smallest thing you can see with your eyes, and then spend some time with the sort of the big picture, right? And so the contemplative forest walk is an invitation to really get into the body and to be present as you walk. And we're very lucky at SFU Burnaby campus because it's on top of a mountain and you can walk in the forest around the campus. So it's a great place to do a contemplative forest walk. And so that's what I would say about the chaplaincy program, right? It's responding to the issue of rising anxiety, and so we're talking about vocation. We're inviting people to cultivate curiosity about their feelings about the climate crisis, and then teaching them contemplative ecology skills to build resilience into their lives. But I think the last piece on that would be this word, grief. And I think becoming more acquainted with loss and losing is going to be important, right? So not only in a personal sense, right, where we find ourselves being, as Francis Weller would say, we find ourselves being initiated by grief when someone close to us dies, but also as the places that we love, and as we fall more deeply in love with our places, are at higher risk, right? Then how do we connect with the loss? How do we metabolize the grief that is surely coming? And in some cases, we're already feeling. And so making that connection between how essential and how integrated love and loss are, right? Grief is the thing you feel from the privilege of loving, right? From the privilege of having loved is what allows us to feel grief. And Stephen Jenkinson would say, he's a Canadian writer, right? He says, grief is a way of loving that which has slipped out of view, but love is a way of grieving that which has not yet done so. Right, and that's in his book Die Wise. And so that's one piece that I'm always trying to sneak into my conversations about anxiety is grief, right? Because there's an important important collective cultural activity of metabolizing loss. And I mean, we're just being bombarded right now in our world with change and loss. And so as Francis Weller teaches, we need more grief tenders out there who can tend to these strange times, right? What he calls the long dark, right? So again, the dark night of the civilizational soul that we may be passing through now is an important idea to me. And also, let me just real quick respond to a couple of chats. The retreat that I mentioned about the Forest Stewards Guild, that's online. So I'll send I have a bunch of links that I can send at the end of this. And so, and Craig asked about Merv Wilkinson. That's the Eco-Forestry Institute on Vancouver Island. They're doing some really cool work, but I haven't actually been to the property over there at Ladysmith. So that's on my list this summer to connect with the Eco-Forestry Institute. But for those in the room, they're a pretty cool organization trying to have, this public conversation about a more selective approach to logging. But in BC, it's a David and Goliath conversation, right? But yeah, Merv Wilkinson was a great teacher of a more restrained forestry on Vancouver Island.
Thank you, Jason, and appreciate you responding to some of those thoughtful comments in the chat. And appreciate you calling forward the emergence of what Weller calls grief tenders, right? And attending to these various forms of lament and suffering that we feel and are sometimes even unconscious. So thank you for helping to explore and embody ways that we can help support ourselves and take care of one another during these difficult times. I thought that would be a good pause point to perhaps break into some breakout rooms, as we typically do, for about 10 minutes. And to use your term, Jason, to metabolize some of the insights you have shared,
Yeah, sure.
and perhaps to brainstorm some questions that we can bring back for the last part of our program. So
Great.
I'll ask our.
I'm happy to do any quick, like if there are any clarifying questions, but otherwise we can do that after.
Sure. Maybe folks can write down any questions they might have, and then we can bring them back to the
Okay.
whole.
Yeah, we'll do that
That's
after.
okay. In about
Sounds good.
10 minutes time. Then we'll have about 20 minutes or so, Jason, to connect as a collective.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Awesome. So Joy will assign us into various rooms. We'll see you in about 10 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
So you want me to go into a room too?
Feel free, please.
Okay, here we go.
Mhm. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your small group discussions and were able to thread together some insights and questions we can share with Jason. I know I really enjoyed my conversation with Guangguo, who is involved in the emergence of a peace university that is bringing together different religions around shared ecology concerns. So that was a great conversation. Jason, would love to hear from you and from anybody in the group. So feel free, Jason, to unmute yourself and be in dialogue. If you have a question, I encourage you to put that in the chat, or you could also use the raised hand feature on the bottom of the screen. We just ask that maybe you try to be concise with maybe one thought or observation that you might pose, so we hear from as many folks as possible.
Sure. Yeah, I had a great conversation with Penny and with Daniel. So, and surprise, surprise, we talked about planting trees.
I see Denise has a hand up. Yeah, would you like to jump in?
Thank you. I was with Carol, and what we kind of focused on was the last comments about grief and grief tenders, and how do we find a grief tender when we're in the midst of grief ourselves? How can we become a grief tender when we're in the midst of grief ourselves over the environment and the things that are happening.
Well,
you.
yeah, I mean, traditionally grief has been a communal experience, right? So a lot of our institutions that are still around, mostly, especially churches, have ways of you know guiding us through grief, right? Sacramentally or ritually. But in some ways it's taken on kind of more of a psychological dimension, like, oh, I'm feeling grief, and it's something that we have to, we've even got the stages of grief, and in some ways the stages of grief are this deep desire to be able to get to the other side of it, right? Like, okay, well, if I move through the stages, then I'm done with it, right? And so Francis Weller's approach is really inviting people to, both do the work of healing their own, past griefs. And so he's got 5 gates of grief that he talks about. One of them's, ancestral grief, or things about us that were not loved as young people, right? So there's a whole range of ways that we can move through our own personal things that we have to grieve personally. But then we move outward, right, into the world, and into the grief of the world and to the harm that we've caused. And I think what Francis Weller is doing through his trainings is training people in hosting community grief rituals where people can come together and talk about grief and talk about their personal grief and reflect on what it would look like to really move the grief, right? Because we've mostly kind of stuffed it down. So a good starting place would be his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And I'm actually in the midst of one of his trainings now on hosting community grief rituals. And Amanda has posted a great example of a group that invites people to reflect on extinction. Right? It's the November 30th is the day for the remembrance of lost species. And this is, I think, an invitation into community spaces, and drawing on ritual from the places where we are, right? So for example, the slender-billed curlew was a species that was declared by ornithologists to be that they were 99.9% confident had gone extinct, and this is the first continental species of shorebird that they can point to that's gone extinct, right? Obviously, the biogeography of islands is a lot more fragile, and a lot of our extinctions and bird extinctions are happening on islands that have had invasive species. But the last year, the slender-billed curlew was one of the first. And so the thing that's interesting to reflect on is that you can't necessarily grieve on command. And though I can acknowledge with my mind that the loss of the slender-billed curlew is tragic and horrific, and it darkens a voice of God in the world, it's hard for me to really connect with the grief to a species that I don't know. And so something that I'm trying to reflect on is, how do we grieve authentically in a time of, digital access to information and, losses on the other side of the world. And so that's, my call to placefulness is invitation into particular places and particular species so that we can both deeply connect and help to protect and save these species, but also be prepared to grieve for them if we lose them. Yeah. But also, I mean, we're going to make mistakes. Like, for example, one of the lost species rituals I saw, they made like some puppets of a passenger pigeon, And they had like a procession, and it was like, oh, the passenger pigeon is extinct. And then they burned them, like in like an effigy. And it's like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like good ritual to me, where we burn the effigies of the pigeon. No. So anyway, we're in a time where we're kind of stumbling through this. And if we're part of cultures that have sort of lost our sense of ritual, our sense of connection, we're going to have to sort of relearn how to listen to the earth, what the world is calling us to, without, necessarily appropriating or romanticizing other cultures' rituals. And so, yeah, Joanna Macy's a great teacher. Thomas Berry's a great teacher. Craig's got his hand up, though. Craig, you have a question or a thought?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Actually, I have a reflection and a question. The reflection is on tree planting. And I think that tree planting has in large part become a justification of industrial forestry. And as Tom Bancroft says, a plantation is no more a forest than a golf course is a prairie. And to think that we can certainly plant trees, but only nature can create a forest. I think that's a very important concept to understand. But also my question is, do you know any universities anywhere in the world that are in fact teaching true selective harvesting, local processing, and what I call end product forest management as a way to really counter industrial forestry, create jobs, create communities, and at the same time respect the forest and leave it as a forest rather than converting it?
Well, great observation, very passionate. It's a much longer, it would take me a lot longer to unpack all of the things you said about forests versus plantations. But I do know that the University of Washington has been, in some ways, criticized by the more industrial forestry oriented universities as being much more interested in forest ecology. So I can't remember the guy's name actually. It'll come to me though, but he's been a forest ecologist for, decades at University of Washington.
Jerry
Uh,
Franklin?
Jerry, there we go, Jerry Franklin. He's the forest ecologist at University of Washington, and he has, gotten a lot of flack from, the Yale School of Forestry was like, it was like, Chad Oliver versus Jerry Franklin in my silviculture classes were like very much framed as this kind of like, are we going to like manage the forest, or are we going to just stand around and look at it? That was kind of their kind of condescending view. And so I do think Yale School of Forestry has a good silvicultural approach, but they don't agree. The paradigm doesn't agree with like the way Jerry Franklin would approach it, which is a much more holistic view, which is good. And I like Jerry Franklin and his approach. I just tend to think that there's a it's maybe too much to unpack in the time that we have, but it sometimes falls into this either or category, right? Where it's either an industrial forest or it's a natural forest. And I think there's so much, space in between, a dynamic ecology, right? Between a plantation and an pristine old growth forest, right? And the best examples of this, right, are indigenous forestry approaches that have not been shifted towards an industrial model like they have in some indigenous territories. But historically, the forestry was forest gardening, right? It was, and on the coast of British Columbia, the forests with the most biodiversity are the forests that were, loved into being by indigenous stewards. So they have food trees, and they have medicine trees, and they have fiber and timber trees. And so I think there's a way in which human beings can return to a better relationship with forests than antagonists or protectors. Right? I think we should be participants. A contemplative forestry is one that draws humans into the ecosystem. And oftentimes when indigenous people do ecological restoration, they're restoring an ecosystem that they're already part of. As opposed to when Western folks do it, we're doing it as an act of public penance. We're trying to repair something and then get out of there, right? We're trying to fix it and leave it alone. And I just don't agree with that approach. I don't think that humans are, I don't believe in the fall, right? I don't think we're inherently evil, and that conservation is just about restraining the human, right? I think a truly Catholic approach to ecology is one that sees human beings as integral to the ecology. And so we could, obviously, Craig, we could have a really good conversation about the nuances of that, the difference between a plantation and forest. But that's kind of my 2 cents on that. And I don't have all the answers to like what symbiosis looks like, because we do need jobs too, right? We got to eat, but it's definitely not the clear cuts that they're doing in northern British Columbia, right? That's like treating a forest like a wheat field. Yeah, other voices. What are some other things that came up in the groups? We've talked about contemplative ecology and trees and ecological anxiety, grief. What are some of the things you're doing to build resilience into your practice, your spiritual practices? Maddie.
Thank you so much. I want to be brief because I have so much I could say. First of all, I really look forward to meeting you. I know we're going to be working together. You're a kindred spirit. I'm a certified nature and forest therapy guide with the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy and a retired professor. But what I have to bring, I waited because I was hoping my small group would speak up. It was so rich, and perhaps some of the others in it will speak up. I love your language. I love this loved into being. I am most recently from London, where I had began a course with Marko Pogacnik, who is from Slovenia, who is a geomancer and has written amazing books, mostly published through Steiner Press. Learning more and more about this broken relationship that we are in the process of mending and growing and learning into. So everything that's been said is so rich and so deeply meaningful to me. For me, this living in the wilds of Western North Carolina, Bat Cave was put on the map by Hurricane Helene. We were also wiped off the map by Hurricane Helene. When you watch the mountains come down, the next morning, I spoke to our caretaker here. I live on a preserve that is the Sisters of the Transfiguration in Cincinnati, a beautiful, almost 500-acre preserve where I do forest bathing, where I have done. The roads are gone, but we're working. But what I wanted to say is next morning, I stood out with our caretakers and I said, if we don't learn from this, we don't deserve to be here. And then he and I looked at the broad river and we both in unison said, it's so beautiful. With all the destruction, the river is fine and it's singing. So I'm learning slowly to sing again. I'm just so very grateful for Sam, for you bringing us together over a year now of this, I think of the mycelium actually, and then I'll be quiet, of how we are building this network of awakening, that we are here as a part of the healing and as a part of the network of what needs to come, and to be open. So to learn what that is every day. So thank you. Deep thanks for your work. I can't wait to read your book. I've already ordered it. I'd love to read your dissertation. I'm a retired professor, so I read
Yeah.
dissertation for fun, but I just want to be quiet now and hear from some of the others. Amanda, maybe you'll speak up. I see her hands up. Much love to everyone. Thank you so much, Sam, and
Nice to meet you, Maddie.
nice to meet you. We'll be seeing each other soon, I'm sure.
Amanda.
Hi, Jason. I
Hi.
felt so much resonance with your talk, from Susan Simard to just walking in the forest, noticing all the details. In my undergrad, I experienced a lot of despair and just living. If you're outside, like the local caribou herd in BC has been extirpated, and the next closest my partner and I went to visit, they're doing a maternity net pen, but you have to wear little hospital booties up a logging road because there's chronic wasting disease for deer that's a prion disease. So the joy that communities coming together to protect and restore and feed and nurture versus the despair. And so every environmental interaction is this merging of awe and wonder with despair and grief. And I've been frustrated with traditional faiths. I grew up Anglican, but others too. They're missing this massive spiritual opportunity, which is people are feeling this solastalgia and this despair and this pain. And where are our ability to not just deal with the climate science and things from an academic or a technical applied, where is our ability to deal with it in a contemplative way? And I am so grateful that you and others are starting to do these things, because I have longed for this for a long time. Thank you.
You're so right. I mean, growing up in the Mormon tradition, I felt personally, so others may disagree, who are Mormon, I felt that it was absolutely allergic to grief. And I've been to a couple of Mormon funerals, and they did not connect with the loss that for example, that we're talking about on that level. And so even just hearing about the Catholic theology of the dark night of the soul was just this immense relief, right? Or Rilke's language of living the questions, just I could just relax spiritually. And so I agree with you, Bando. As we move towards through, in the Christian liturgical calendar, as we move towards Good Friday, right? We're in a civilizational Good Friday, right? And you cannot get to the resurrection unless you go through the cross, right? You can't get there. And we're so, we're very, very hesitant to sit at the tomb, right, with Mary Magdalene, and to wait for resurrection. And that's a that's a civilizational problem, right? That, we're uncomfortable with death and crucifixion. And it's certainly, we're talking about a kind of ecological crucifixion at this time. And so the Paschal Mystery is for me a beautiful archetype. When of course, it's many other things for many other people, but archetypically it is a beautiful thing. And yet I think there's some theological work to be done on an archetypal Paschal Mystery that should probably include decomposition, right? Like, we want to go from death to resurrection and ascension, right? Like, we want to go up and out, and we need to go down and in, right? And that, I think, is an important possibility in this archetypal Paschal Mystery, right? That we have to find ways to compost, some of the times that we're living in. So solastalgia is a word that emerges from our need to compost the times so that we can nourish the next ecosystems, right? We're talking about we're not just talking about saving existing ecologies, we're talking about living into new ecologies, right? So Daniel's planting trees, and I think we should be planting trees that might be good dialogue partners with the climates that might emerge in our places. So in my part of the world, Gary oak is a drought adapted oak species, the only oak species we have in BC. But the only reason the oaks are around is because indigenous peoples incorporated them into their food systems and then used fire to manage those oak savannas. As the climate got wetter and wetter, and Douglas fir overtopped them. But now, right, we're talking about much drier summers. So I think Gary oak might be a really good dialogue partner in the Pacific West to have this conservation conversation about what a new ecology might look like. So yeah, that's that. I'm just basically echoing what you say, Amanda. I really appreciate your comments about the frustration, the beauty and the pain of doing this work in these times.
Thank you, Jason, for bringing us both into a place that honors our grief and allowing us to sit there, and also into a place of wonder and restoration and possibility. So I know I'm holding both of those poles of our human experience together as we move forward into our night here. I'm going to put a link to Jason's blog in the chat. So I encourage folks to follow and read Jason's writing. Any parting message from you, Jason, on ways to stay connected?
Well, I've got an email list that you can sign up for at the blog. And I'm doing a lot on trees and forests this year. So I have an in-person retreat coming up at Sorrento in BC. If anyone's interested in making the trek to BC in August, the first week of August, we're going to do the Trees and Forests workshop in person at Sorrento Retreat Center, which will be fun. But then otherwise, the Forest Stewards Guild is all online. So if anyone wants to tune into that. But yeah, I would just invite people to close their computers and connect with their bodies and then their place as soon as this is over. And just explore what it might mean to really live in the places where you are now. And I say that as a person who has a very complicated relationship with Vancouver, right? Like I've been here over a decade and I have a hard time loving this city. It has a reputation for being one of the loneliest cities on the West Coast, right? So I'm not coming to you from a place of privilege where I've just got this great setup, but placefulness as a practice is really important to me, of really noticing the changes in the seasons, the changes in the days, and trying to intersect those the place trying to explore both the inner and the outer landscape is maybe a better way of saying it, which was how I came up with that idea of holyscapes, is that the intersections of inner and outer landscapes. And as we mentioned, right, the quiet monasticism, right, that's not trying to take over the world. It's just their monks are just living their quiet contemplative lives. I think they do this very intuitively. And we have I think there's a lot we can learn from contemplative spiritualities of many religions, the Buddhists, the Taoists, the Sufis, and the Hindu monks, as well as the Benedictine and the Eastern Orthodox traditions. They all have so much to teach us. But for those of us who live outside of the monastic institutional life, right, we're invited into this practice of the everyday, right, the holiness of everyday life in our homes, in our communities, in our churches, or other religious institutions, in our communities, and in the places and the regions that we call home. And in some ways, this chaplaincy word is an invitation to chaplain the place, right? In what ways can you care for the places that you live? What kind of offerings of beauty can you give to the place, right? This is, oh shoot, what's her name? Radical Joy for Hard Times, Treby Johnson, right? What offerings of beauty can you give to the place? So exploring ways in which you can chaplain the place is an invitation that I often give at the end of a contemplative ecology retreat. So I'd just invite people to do that, reflect on that question. All right, what are some places you could visit more often, or maybe every day? And what are some ways that you might care for, or even just pray for those places?
Wonderful parting message, Jason. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who gathered here this evening. And I hope to see you next month on May 5th with Dr. Aaron Loathes, who's an eco-theologian who will be joining us next month. So thanks so much, Jason, for being with us this evening.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Be in touch. My email's on the SFU website and Holyscapes as well. But so good to meet all of you, and I hope you have a great evening. I hope you get off the computer and hope you're in touch soon. It's really great to be here. Thanks for having me, Sam. Thanks for having me, Garrick. Yes.
Thanks so
All
much.
right.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.